Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Roman social life in our continuing study of world civilizations. The Roman family had its head as the father. That means it was a patriarchal society. The father ruled the family. Um, and so when a marriage took place, it was at the father's approval. A wife would come in and would come in with a dowry where the bride's family had paid a dowry price for the upkeep of the wife. Romans were monogamous. They only had one wife at a time. That's a bit different from some of the Greek kings that would have a plurality of wives, even the Jewish people, although that had gone out of custom by the time we get to the New Testament. But the Jewish people earlier in the history of the Jews had practiced polygamy. So the Romans were monogamous, one wife at a time. That means divorce could and did take place. In fact, it was quite easy to get a divorce as long as you could return the bride's dowry price. That was actually governed by law. She had come in with so much money that had been paid for her upkeep in the family. But then, if a divorce took place, the husband that was divorcing his wife had to return all of that to his wife. If he couldn't, well, he was bound by law to do so. And we have instances, I think it was Cicero who divorced his wife and had spent the dowry. And so he had to go around and take up loans in order to pay the dowry price back. Under those conditions, Romans could engage in divorce and remarriage. Adultery was frowned upon. That was considered a serious thing, especially on the part of the woman. Now, that didn't stop it from happening, just like it doesn't stop it from happening in today's Western society. Um, Children were the property of the family, and indeed, a newborn child, technically any children, lived and died at the whim of the father. We actually have letters that are sent where a Roman uh, husband sends a letter to his wife who's pregnant, about to give birth, and he says, if it's a girl, take her out and throw her away. Just kill the child. They would typically take a baby that's unwanted and just out into the forest and leave it there for anybody to come along and pick up, or wild animals to come and eat. That way, they hadn't technically killed the child themselves. It was left in the hands of the gods. Um, and the law allowed a father to do this to any of his children, even children that were further advanced in age, even a grown-up child, technically. Although this almost never happened. Those cases where it did happen were in very early Roman history. For example, the story of Brutus, the hero of the Republic, going back to around 50, I think it was 509 BC, had his two sons killed because they had been involved in a plot to overthrow the republic and return the kings. And he had been consul, and he had ordered the death of his own two sons. But that was used as sort of a scare tactic. You better obey your father, or else he could have the legal right to put you to death. That was almost never done as we get to the period of the Roman Empire. And yet, the idea of children obeying their parents, that was strongly entrenched. Now, that doesn't mean they always did it, but they were always supposed to. And remember how in the New Testament, Paul says, children, obey your parents. That's not necessarily just limited to infant children or very, very young children. That's just a blanket statement and would be interpreted as such by the readers. Now, infant mortality was a very big thing. So, parents didn't usually get rid of their children. Sometimes they did. Like I said, that letter where somebody writes and says, if it's a girl, go ahead and expose it. If it's a boy, keep it, which tells us that at least this one father was more interested in having boys than girls, because a son could carry on the family name and could take care of you when you were older, and girls were not considered as worthwhile by that patriarchal culture. They had a high infant mortality rate. Sometimes we say that the average lifespan of people during this period and all throughout the ancient world was around 30 to 35 years. Now, what we mean by that wasn't that most people died when they were 30 or 35 years old. It's that a great many died in infancy or childhood diseases. But if you made it past that period into adulthood, then you could reasonably expect to continue on to old age as long as you weren't caught by disease or warfare or starvation or some other thing that could come along. But it wasn't that everybody died in their 30s, and sometimes people don't get that. Adoption was also a thing where a husband and wife whose either children had died or else they were childless, and that was considered not a good thing. In fact, it was considered a dishonorable thing if you didn't have children, especially for the wife. But they could go and adopt someone, not necessarily an infant or a very young child. Sometimes that adoption would be an adult son, maybe the son of somebody else who had extra children, or perhaps a slave or someone else, a free man. If it was a slave, he'd been set free and then adopted. But a man could be adopted by another man and therefore would be obligated to care for that family in their old age, but then also would receive the inheritance, and that would it's a little bit like purchasing your Social Security or purchasing your retirement fund. The Romans, especially the wealthy Romans, would have tutors for their children. That tutor could often be a slave. The father, as I said, was the center of the Roman family, and all the family land belonged to him to do with as he wishes. He decided, as I said, if newborns lived or died, and they regularly made that decision. His children could only marry with his approval. Now, did everybody obey this? I'm sure there were those rebellious sorts that didn't. But we also have occasions, especially among the either nobility or even up in the area of the Roman emperors, we have times when a father would come home and say, I've decided you're going to divorce your wife, and I have another wife picked out for you over here, and your new wedding is set for tomorrow, and where things like that actually took place. Now, that didn't happen all the time. That wasn't a regular sort of thing, but the father had that kind of authority. And so remember in Ephesians chapter 6, where Paul says, children, obey your parents, he turns right around and says, fathers, do not provoke your children. That's not saying don't spank your children, don't discipline them, but it's saying don't do unreasonable things like that, especially, I would think, to your adult children. And so there's a cautionary injunction that's given to Christians not to take that authority and carry it too far. As I said, the father had legal power of life and death over the entire family. He didn't always carry that out, but under the law, he could and would not be punished by the law. Sons who married would continue to live with their wives under his roof. So here we have the father, and notice I'm calling them the patron. I'm going to bring something else out in just a moment. But the husband, he has a wife, and he has children, and they all live at home, not only while they are young, but even when they get married. If one takes a wife, she comes into the household, and that's why the dowry comes with her, because she's going to be an added expense. And so to feed her and clothe her and take care of her, her father will send a certain amount of money that is returned in the event of a divorce. But notice they don't go out and live on their own, like apartment complex across town. No, they live in that larger family, and they become part of that family. And when the father finally dies, then his oldest surviving son becomes the new patron, the new patriarch of the family. And of course, the wife would have an honored, the mother would have an honored position, but she's no longer the wife. She's now grandmother. She has an honored position, but it's not quite the same. They would also have slaves, because slavery was a thing in that day and age. Now, not everybody had slaves, but all wealthy families did. and even some poorer families. Now, in a poorer family, you might see, for example, the father was a farmer, and he might have one or two slaves. But when you looked at them out in the field, they're all working in the field. They actually look quite alike, because the slaves are working and the father farmer is working because he has to work. And but the more wealthy the family, the more the patriarch, the patron, could sit at home and direct the entire family and carry out their affairs. But not only would he have his immediate family and extended family, he might also have certain clients. These were people to whom he had done a favor. Um, and so they might be fathers of their own families. They might be have various positions, but because he had done them a favor, they were now beholden to him, and so they were part of his extended sphere of influence. And anytime he asked them to do something, they owed him. And it was understood, this client patron privilege, that was understood to continue basically for as long as they lived. And so they might get up in the morning and take care of business, and then they would go to the home of the patron and wait outside for him to get up and come out. They'd be sitting on a bench out in front of his home, and they would ask, do you have any service for me to do? And if none, then you can go about your day. And but if so, then they would perform a service for the patron, and they would be really at his beck and call. Now, I want to talk next about slavery in the Roman world. Slaves were property, and it didn't matter if you were white or black. That wasn't an issue. A black could own a white slave. A white could own a black slave. It wasn't about race. It was about ownership, and slaves were considered property. As such, a slave had no personal rights, at least not early in the Republic and even at the beginning of the empire. They could own property subject to the whim of the master, and as such, they could. You might even have a slave that for some reason owned another slave, although really, if he had the funds to do that, he'd probably seek to purchase his own freedom. The master could inflict upon them both corporal and capital punishment. By corporal punishment, we're looking at beatings or some other physical form of punishment. By capital punishment, we mean that the slave could be killed by his master. Now, later on, that's going to change, but early in the history, he had power of life and death over his slaves. That didn't mean he would just put them to death at a whim, because slaves were property. It's like, if you own your own car, that doesn't mean you're going to go out and wreck it just because you feel like it. It represents a valuable resource. It costs you money, and so a slave was considered a valuable resource. You didn't get rid of it. But there were slaves could be sexually exploited, and they regularly were. They had no choice in matters of sexuality. They could not testify in legal proceedings except under torture, which meant that a slave didn't really want to witness something, because if he did witness a crime and had to testify, he couldn't just tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. He had to be tortured, and then the statement wrung out of him by torture. Here's a slave collar, and there's an inscription upon it. Notice it's an inscription offering reward for the returning escaped slave. The idea is that if you see him, this slave with his collar, he can't necessarily read it. Maybe he can, maybe he can't. But it's not really a position where he's able to bring it up to his face to read it. And it says, return to so and so for reward if you find this slave. Some slaves had been taught to read and write. I said earlier that children would be under a tutor. That is, young children would be taught to read and write. Not everyone knew how to read and write, but those who were wealthier usually had some sort of education. And slaves sometimes were taught to read and write so that they could either become tutors or scribes or otherwise involved. In Romans chapter 16, we have in Paul's epistle to the Romans, there comes right toward the end of the chapter, Tertius is a name of a person who writes, I, Tertius, who am writing this epistle, writing this letter, salute you. So and that's a slave name. So here's a slave by the name of Tertius. He is actually writing the Epistle to the Romans. Paul is dictating, and he's writing. And at one point, he just says hi to his readers. And it's interesting that he feels completely free to do that, and Paul's not going to get upset at him. Was he now a free slave? Was he a slave who was on loan to the Apostle Paul, so that just for the purpose of writing this? Was he a slave who was still a slave, but maybe on his off time was being allowed to work for Paul and pen this letter? We don't know the details, but his voice is actually in the Epistle to the Romans. Manumission comes from the manus is your hand. Slaves were sometimes set free. It could be as a reward for loyalty. Their freedom could be purchased either by a friend or relative, or if they were able to save up money themselves. It would take quite a bit of money to do that, and slaves didn't have regular incomes. But if they were able to, then perhaps they could even purchase their own freedom. Manumissio means sending out from the mano, from the hand. And so that meant that you were able to gain your freedom if you had been manumitted. When you were set free, if you had been a slave, you were given the pileus, the cap. Notice he's wearing that sort of conical cap that was given as a symbol of manumission. It was given as a symbol saying that you were a slave and now you're free. That way, if anybody saw you that knew you had been a slave, this was sort of the outward sign. Yes, you've been set free, and it's okay. You're not a runaway. You're not going to be. Of course, you didn't want to lose the cap, but it served as a little bit of a status. You're no longer a slave. Now you're a free person, and therefore have certain rights that you did not previously have as a slave. Freed Romans became citizens. If you'd been a slave of a Roman, now if you were a slave of somebody else, that didn't do anything, but if you had been the slave of a Roman citizen and now you became free, you automatically became a citizen if the master himself was a Roman citizen. That doesn't mean you could hold public office. You were still, I guess we'd call it a second-class citizen, but that was better than not being a citizen at all. That was something else. And it was also just assumed that you're going to show loyalty toward your patron. Remember how we described the clients and the patrons? You were now a client of that patron who had set you free, if indeed he was the one who had accomplished that. You sort of owed him, and it was understood that even though you're free and you can do what you want, you're still going to repay him out of that client-patron sort of gratitude idea that was ingrained into the Roman system. Children born after manumission could hold public office. If you had a child that had been born prior to that, and even though the child might now be set free, that still came under that guideline where such a child could not hold public office. Now that's going to change. That's going to change in the mid-first century, and the reason I know that is because we're going to see an individual. His name is going to be Felix. And remember, he's the Roman procurator that holds the Apostle Paul in prison. He's trying to get a bribe. He's holding out for a bribe. Felix is a slave name, and not just from his name. We know from elsewhere in history that he had been the favorite of the mother of the Emperor Claudius. And so she had sort of arranged not only for his freedom, but also that he got this nice, cushy job as procurator, like the chief tax collector in all of Israel. And that was a high public office, even though he had formerly been a slave. The child of a master and slave could be freed, but could not be adopted. So there were certain restrictions that had been in place. Now, slavery in the first century, the Pax Romana, remember how under the Emperor Octavius Augustus, there was a lessening of how many wars were fought. And I'm not saying there were no wars fought, but there weren't quite so many. And that peace, that Roman peace, led to fewer slaves being captured in battle. And so it led to a scarcity of slaves. There's sort of a supply and demand thing that go on, where the less there is of something, the more valuable it gets. And so Octavius Augustus decreed that no slave could be freed before the age of 30. He wanted to keep a handle on how many slaves there were. There was a growing shortage, so he's taking executive decisions to make sure that they keep their slaves. That he placed a 2% sales tax on slaves. Later on, we're going to see that raised. Um, and under Claudius, he's 41 to 54 AD, and under him, the killing of a sick or old slave became murder. Again, they're trying to on the one hand, maybe that's a kindness because a sick or old slave isn't worth that much, and that's why there was the temptation. Well, if I just kill him, then I don't have to pay for his upkeep. But now that becomes murder, and there's a requirement to take care of your sick or old slave. Abandoning a slave, you could abandon him, and abandoning a slave set him free automatically. The sales tax, as I said, it was 2% under Octavius Augustus. It was increased to 4%. Notice what they're trying to do is they're trying to limit how many slaves are free. It's not that a lot were being set free, but they were trying to keep a handle on slavery, and the government-sponsored effect was to lessen and to even penalize and maybe make a little bit of money off of slaves that were being freed. Now, slaves in the New Testament. I mentioned Marcus Antonius Felix had been the slave of Antonia, the mother of Emperor Claudius, and he is set free and becomes the procurator of Judea. We see him in the later chapters of the book of Acts, where he is the procurator who's in charge when the Apostle Paul is arrested in Acts chapter 21 and brought before him in later chapters and actually hears the gospel. You also have a reference in Acts chapter 6 and verse 9 to the synagogue of the freedmen. Now, this seems to have been, but first of all, it was in Jerusalem, but it was a synagogue that was populated primarily, I'm assuming, just by its title, that there were those who were former slaves. They were former slaves, and think about this: if you were a Jewish slave being owned by somebody else, you were probably owned by somebody that was not Jewish. So these are Jewish people, or maybe in some cases, they've been converted to Judaism. So either where they have converted to Judaism, received circumcision, or else they were Jewish themselves, but they had been slaves and now they've been set free. If you've been set free, if you've been belonged to a Gentile at a previous era, especially if you belonged to him and were under enough good graces to eventually be set free, you probably spoke his language. And so these freedmen, these Jewish freedmen, they maybe spoke Hebrew, but they also spoke other languages like Greek, maybe some Latin. So there were other languages represented there, and we see Stephen involved with them. They had a synagogue of their own in Jerusalem, and they seem to have been Greek speakers because Stephen, who himself has a Greek name, he's speaking out with them, and that leads to some conflict and eventually to his arrest and trial, and he is killed. Not legally, actually. The Jews didn't have the authority to put anybody to death, but they perform an illegal stoning, and they stone him to death. And you remember that the Apostle Paul, he wasn't an apostle yet, but Paul, also known as Saul, he is consenting to that death, and he's there and giving consent and maybe aiding a little bit by watching the cloaks of those who were actually accomplishing the deed. Next, I want to speak about leisure in the ancient world. And three areas that we want to speak about. First of all, something distinctively Roman were the Roman baths. Now, I don't mean just where you go into your house and take a shower like I do, but rather the bath was a community affair. You're actually looking at one section of a bath that started as early. Oh, and this is in Pompeii. I took this photo. We're going to show a few pictures from Pompeii, and then we'll move somewhere else. Started as early as 200 BC. We know that from I think it's a play that is written around this time, and part of it takes place at the public bath. The term for a public bath was a thermae. Notice that sounds a little bit like thermometer or thermal, which is a reference to heat. And sure enough, the layout involved a warm room, a hot room, and a cold room, not necessarily in that order, but all Roman baths had these three rooms. Now, sometimes they would have many other rooms too, but at the very basic, they would have these three rooms: a warm room, a hot room, and a cold room. And here we're looking, this is another scene from the same bath at Pompeii, very ornate along the walls. Notice the statuary, because this was public, a public event, going to the bath. There were separate baths for men and for women. So you'd have, if you had them for both, you'd have the one section with those three rooms for women, another section with those three rooms for men. They would not bathe together, but all the men would bathe together, and all the women would bathe together. And these served as community centers, so that everyone was encouraged to come to the bath, and this would be your recreation. It would also be a social occasion. Here is the bath at Scythopolis. This is in Israel, on the east side of the valley of Jezreel, same place that was also known as Bethshan, a place where the bodies of Saul and Jonathan had been hung up. But now, when we get to the New Testament era, notice this is a Roman bath, and you have the big pool, community pool, where the men, I'm assuming this is the men quarters. There'd be a separate one for the woman if they had that at this particular bath. This would be filled with water, and I know it looks sort of rustic now, but that's been 2,000 years of weathering, so you wouldn't look too good after 2,000 years either. And then when you go into the hot room, now notice the floor has been removed to display the piping that brought hot air and humidity into the room. So think in terms of a sauna. You would go in and you would sweat very heavily, and first you had taken a cold bath, and you'd been there in the water, and then you might start off with fun and games, maybe throwing a ball or some sort of exercise routine, playing an ancient form of soccer, something like that, and then you would go into the cold water, and then the very hot area, and then into a warm area where you would be rubbed down with oils, and then that would be scraped. Now, the other thing that the Romans used to attend was the circus. Now, when you hear circus, don't think clowns and trapeze artists, but rather think of the Roman chariot races. And so this was a form of entertainment. The circuses were sponsored by the rich patrons. Remember, I said patron client? Well, these are patrons that would have the whole city as their clients, and they would sponsor the Roman circus. And here we have a picture of what the Circus Maximus in Rome would look like, a very large racing arena. But you had circuses not just in Rome. You find them all over the Roman Empire. This one happens to be at Aphrodisias. This is in modern day Turkey. I'm actually standing under the place where the chariots would roll out into the stadium. Laodicea had its own circus. Caesarea in Israel had its own circus. There's even reputed to have been a circus either in or very close to Jerusalem. I don't think we've actually located the exact location where it was, but Josephus speaks of a circus in that area. Finally, we want to talk about the gladiatorial games. Gladiators, the word gladius was referred to a sword, but it wasn't limited to swords. They could have a variety of weapons. And these began around the time of the Punic Wars and continued up into the Christian era. They were still underway in the days of the New Testament. Um, and these were made free to the public. There was no admittance charge. In fact, you would go and you would not only get free entertainment, but you would also get free bread. So the expression bread and circuses was sort of a note that they gave to the crowds: free food and free entertainment in return for your vote. I think that might have been the idea behind it. History hasn't changed too much. Politicians are still promising free things to people if only they'll vote for them. Tertullian, a Christian living in the very early 200s, writes a treatise about how Christians should not attend these gladiatorial games. The fact that he has to write this letter and write these instructions maybe gives us a hint that there were some that were still attending. That's where you went. It was their version of going to the movies or something like that, except that people are actually being killed. Sometimes it would be animal and animals against animals, people against animals, people against people. You had both professional gladiators as well as criminals that were sentenced to death in the arena, and so that's how it would take place. And Tertullian said we shouldn't be using that as entertainment. And so once you have a Christian emperor, and Constantine comes, when he becomes emperor and declares that he is becoming a Christian, the gladiatorial games are phased out. The circuses continue. They're not going to go away. And the baths are going to continue. They're not going to go away. In fact, you have Roman baths all the way into perhaps even into the Middle Ages, where you begin to sort of move in different realms. But the locations of those, if you go to England, even in the 1800s, I'm assuming it's still there, but in the 1800s, there was a city called Bath. It got its name from the Roman baths that were there. But the gladiatorial games had now become a thing of the past. They were discontinued when Christianity came on the scene.